Right, I think we're going to get going, everyone. Welcome today, and well done for getting here. I hope your journeys have been okay, but well done for battling tube strikes. So I think everyone's done it very well. It's an incredible turnout considering all of the different challenges we've had to deal with and on the journey in. Welcome to the panel discussion for Room to Grow, which is all about school-based nurseries and the disadvantage gap. I'm Eleanor Ireland. I'm a programme head at the Nuffield Foundation, and I look after our early years work. And it was a real honour to be able to fund this really important piece of research. At the Nuffield Foundation, we've been funding research about the early years sector for well over 20 years. And as we're all really well aware, there is really good evidence about the supportive role that attending early years education and childcare can have for children's development, particularly for children from disadvantaged backgrounds, but only when the education that they receive is high quality. And we know, of course, that gaps between more advantaged and less advantaged children emerge really early before they start school, and those gaps tend to widen as they progress through the education system. So early years education can play a really fundamental role in potentially reducing that disadvantage gap, but only if disadvantaged children are actually able to access early years education and the early years education that they receive is high quality. And so these are the reasons that we were really keen to fund this research, not only because of the incredible research team, some of whom you're going to be hearing from in a moment, but because this evaluation focused on these really important elements of the school-based nursery programme, whether the programme is reaching families experiencing high levels of disadvantage and whether it's having an effect on the quality of provision, so i.e. the extent to which the programme is able to potentially address the disadvantage gap. Now, it did, of course, have other policy aims as well, and the research has shown that it has had some success in delivering new nursery places, which may have potentially helped some parents to back into work. But there does seem to be some limited appetite amongst schools without early years provision currently to set up new nurseries. But the report has got some really clear and focused recommendations about how to support schools in the continued expansion, particularly in addressing some of the financial barriers, such as ongoing running costs, as well as initial startup costs. But, one of the key findings, as we all know, coming out of this report is that the school-based nurseries tend to be in areas that are not experiencing higher levels of disadvantage. And that's really important, as it suggests that the programme isn't yet reaching as many children who might be able to benefit from it as it possibly could. And it also is a little bit unclear at this stage whether the programme is able to provide these high-quality places that we know are so important in addressing the disadvantage gap. But again, the report has these really clear recommendations about how some of these issues can be addressed. So it gives a lot of really clear focus as to where to go next with the expansion of the school-based nursery programme. The other point that I think is particularly important relates to younger children. And the research found, unsurprisingly, that most school-based nursery provision is for the 3 to 5-year-old age group, with more limited places available for 2 to 3-year-olds and even fewer available for the 1 to 2-year-olds. So I think something we really need to think about is if we want school-based nurseries to be able to provide early years education and childcare for this youngest group, we need to be wary about the schoolification of early years education and childcare, and to ensure that the spaces that are provided by school-based nurseries are appropriate for toddlers and for babies, and that the staff working with them have the right skills and expertise to be able to look after the youngest children. I'm not going to say any more because these are some of the issues that the panel will discuss in a moment, but I just wanted to thank the research team for this really important and highly policy relevant piece of work. And with that, I'll hand over to Carl. Thanks, Carl.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. Thanks for that great introduction to the event, and also I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the Nuffield Foundation, for both as a funder for this project, but also for their great support and feedback throughout the project as well. They've been absolutely great to work with, and it's been a fantastic experience. So I'd reiterate, welcome to everyone, and thank you for coming today. I can only imagine the kind of planes, trains and automobiles that people have used to get here. I would also hello to people watching it on catch-up at home. Sorry you've not been able to make it. I would say that the phone lines are now closed, so please don't call the number at the bottom of your screen. But yeah, so today's event is about the Room to Grow project, which is a partnership between the Sutton Trust, who are the UK's leading social mobility charity focused on breaking the link between family background and life chances. And we do this through programmes, particularly focused on access to the university and careers, but also a programme of research and policy, of which this is part. And our partners with the Social Market Foundation, who are Britain's leading cross-party think tank, whose mission is to enable markets and government to work together to benefit society, which is obviously highly relevant for the topic we're talking about today, through both research and policy work. So my name is Carl Cullinan. I'm Director of Research and Policy at the Sutton Trust and the Principal Investigator on this project, which involved less trench coats and magnifying glasses to what I was expecting. But so the background to this project is, of course, the school-based nursery policy of the Labour government. It's one of the key flagship policies, basically, in early years of this government, which aim to set up 3,000 new or expanded nurseries across the country to address childcare deserts and sufficiency of places, particularly with the rollout of new entitlements over the last couple of years, using spare space and facilities in schools. So there have been a number of phases so far. So the first rollout of schools started in last September. In initial 300 schools. The second phase was announced back in March, which had a bit more of a focus on disadvantage, which was welcome from our point of view, and a strengthened role of local authorities in the process. And then phase 3 will be starting later in the year, which takes quite a different model with a much stronger role of local authorities in applications, where all the applications will run through local authorities rather than being made by individual schools and providers. But I think the reason we wanted to do this piece of work, so firstly, it's a very key government policy that we wanted to make sure that we had evidence for in terms of informing the rollout of, and particularly because there is a bit of a lack of evidence based on school-based nurseries, what particularly works in those kind of settings, what are their strengths and weaknesses in comparison to other models. But also we saw, from the Sutton Trust perspective, we saw the potential of school-based nurseries from a social mobility point of view. So number one, because of the highly qualified staff that school-based nurseries often have in terms of quality of provision, but also secondly, they're more likely to be located in disadvantaged areas and thus could be a key lever in terms of reducing those school readiness gaps. So that's the background to the research. And my colleague Becky will talk a bit more about the details. So we'll have the members of the panel will each speak for around 5 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So we have a great panel for you here today, and we'll start off with Dr. Rebecca Montacute, who is Research Director at the Social Market Foundation. She's also co-principal investigator on the project. And she leads the SMF's programme of research across a wide range of social and economic policy areas. And not coincidentally, Becky was also head of research at the Sutton Trust until last year.
Should I pop up to the...
No.
Yeah.
And so, after that, we'll have Lawrence Turner MP, who's a Labour MP for Birmingham Northfield, previously worked at head of policy at the GMB. He has championed early years education and access to SEND support, and I believe he has several school-based nurseries in his constituency, so looking forward to hearing that perspective. Katie Oliver joins us, who has been at ARC, Multi-Academy Trust, for pretty much 20 years now, and oversees ARC Ventures and is Managing Director of ARC Start, which operates 5 nurseries in London with plans to expand, and she'll bring the kind of multi-academy trust experience, particularly setting up new nurseries. We also have Tiffany Harris from Askill. She leads on primary and early years at Askill, expert particularly on using data to inform school improvement and outcomes for children, particularly from disadvantaged backgrounds. And I should say both Katie was also on our advisory board for the project, which we were very grateful for. And then last but not least, we have Neil Leach, who's a long-term friend of the Trust, but also Chief Executive of the Early Years Alliance, which is the largest early years membership organisation, and representing around 14,000 nurseries, preschools and childminders across the country. So we'll kick off by handing over to Becky to talk about the project in a bit more detail.
Cool. I'll probably just stay here for easier, yeah. Yeah, so Carl's given some really useful background there on what the policy is, why we first wanted to look at it. So the programme was first launched in late 2024, and I would say it didn't have a huge amount of attention at the time. It very much was okay, here's a DfE press release, there's going to be some stuff happening on school-based nurseries. And a big part of the reason that as a research team we wanted to do this project was that we thought it wasn't getting the attention that it deserved outside of kind of the DfE absolute policy circles. And we wanted to make sure that a light was properly shone on the project to really understand what are the benefits of doing this, what are the drawbacks, how well is the project going currently, what do they need to think about for future. And, you know, the idea makes a lot of sense, right? We've got falling birth rates, lots of empty classroom spaces. Why not make sure that actually we're using that for something useful? We also had at that time the expansion of the funded hours, so the need for lots more childcare places, and that was a big driver for government at that time, as well as obviously this aim that the government have to increase the amount of children who are meeting a good level of development. So this policy was very much positioned as being a way to deal with both of those issues. And we thought also potentially quite a big change to how early education, how childcare is delivered in England, particularly if it went well and ended up being a model that could be taken on more broadly. So what did we do in this research? Well, first of all, we wanted to look at the existing evidence base. And as Carl has spoken about, it was relatively limited, but there is useful wider research that has been brought out in the literature review for this work with relevance to the policy. And I'd say a huge thank you to the colleagues who worked with us on this from the Centre for Research in Early Education, who wrote the literature review portion of the study. So their research found, first off, that existing school-based provision has real strengths, particularly for disadvantaged children. So existing research finds these settings are more likely to provide places to disadvantaged children and those with SEND, as well as offer high-quality provision with better qualified staff and strong links to schools. But they also found that suitability is likely to vary by age. So the point that Eleanor made about the risk of schoolification of the early years, and that's something we heard throughout the report, is the importance of taking existing expertise, and a lot of that is also, it's important to say, in the private, voluntary and independent sector, when you're setting up this provision and making sure, particularly for younger age groups, that that expertise is taken into account. But also internationally, this kind of approach is actually really rare. So while lots of countries are expanding early years provision to younger ages, very few of them are doing it actually within schools, although there was a really interesting study in France which did look at helping children from disadvantaged areas to access school-based preschools from the age of 2, and they did find benefits from that approach. So there was some really useful existing literature, and do have a look at the wider literature review in the report. Next, we wanted to understand much better what was actually happening in schools on the ground at the moment, the views of those within primary schools, and whether or not they were both doing this already and open to doing it in future for the further phases of the programme. So we did a survey of 1,300 primary school senior leaders via Teacher Tap and asked them questions about, do you already have a school-based nursery? Is this something that you're doing? Actually, it was quite a high proportion, so just over half of the senior leaders who we surveyed reported that there was early years provision on site. And that was higher than I'd really expected, I think, going in. And particularly those with more disadvantaged intakes were more likely to have that type of provision. But as you might expect, those settings were more likely to focus on older children, so virtually all of them actually served 3 to 4-year-olds, but then it gradually came down as you went, or actually quite sharply came down as you went to younger age groups. So 42% of them covered 2 to 3-year-olds, and only 6% said they had provision for 1 to 2-year-olds. So this does seem to be a much better setup for those older early years age groups. We also found that they faced several barriers to setting up new early years provisions. So some of the main barriers were not having the right kind of, particularly the most common one, indoor space at 51%. They also cited high startup costs at 50%, even though the actual thing that the policy is giving these schools is the ability to help with those infrastructure setup costs. That was still seen as a barrier for many. And also for 46% financial viability. And that's one thing that really came out also through the case studies we did, is the concern about the running costs day to day. Any of you who are really familiar with early years policy will know a lot of the concerns about the viability of day-to-day running costs within those settings, and that was something that came out as one of those issues. Now, as you might expect, given those barriers, actually appetite for further expansion, while it does exist, is quite limited. So out of those that don't already have a setting, 1 in 5 either said that their school already had plans to set one up, or it was likely to, but that's a relatively small proportion of them. 3% had plans in place, and 5% said it was very likely that there will be one set up, and 12% said it is quite likely. But the majority said that it's not likely that they will set one up. So there's still a lot to go if we wanted a model where this was much more kind of common, and most primary schools had this kind of setting, who didn't already have one, did look to further increase one. And that we do think there's a real challenge in being able to actually get to the targeted 3,000 settings of the programme, given the limited appetite for further expansion. Now, I don't have time to talk in depth about the actual case studies in this kind of quick run through now. Do have a look at them on the website. It's really interesting. We talked to lots of different settings who already had a school-based nursery, and it really shows, first of all, the diversity of provision. There's lots of different types of provision. It's really varied. But also the kind of benefits that they found in terms of being able to have close relationships to school and the importance of co-location specifically, but also some of the barriers that they were facing and the things that they saw as challenges. So I'd really recommend having a look at those. So I'm just going to wrap up by talking through some of the major policy recommendations from the report. So first off, we absolutely think that the school-based nursery programme should continue. It is a good programme. It has lots of positives about it, and we do think there are signs of elements of quality and actually being able to enable and improve those connections between earlier settings and schools. We do also have some recommendations in the report about more broadly helping schools in earlier settings to build connections, because I do think that's important and could be done and is shown through the report more widely. So we definitely think that there are major benefits, but also there are limitations. We've already discussed the fact that many disadvantaged areas actually haven't benefited in the way perhaps they could have from this rollout. Now, there are some signs of benefits to that. So, for instance, the third phase does have Best Start Family Hubs included. That's quite a different model from the school-based nurseries themselves. I think there's limitations to the learnings of the wider SBM programme to those. But there are lots of positives to that approach, particularly the fact that it's a way to get to more disadvantaged areas. So that looks like a real positive. We also think that financial barriers need to be addressed, and particularly in those long-term running costs. The government should also be cautious not to dilute the original intention of the programme going forward. And we also think it's really important to use learnings from the programme to look more widely at the setup of the early years wider ecosystem, the balance between state and private, where one works, where the other doesn't, particularly around kind of wraparound care and outside of school term time. PVIs can really help in a way that actually these school-based settings just can't.
Great. Thank you very much, Becky, and for summarising the report and findings, which are extremely rich in such a short amount of time. But we've plenty of time to kind of get into a lot of those issues in more detail during the rest of the session. But yeah, next up we have Lawrence Turner, MP.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to speak at this event. I think the best value that I can provide is to offer some perspective on the origins of this policy, because as Becca said, when it was first announced, it was done so relatively quietly, but it was a manifesto policy, and policy making in opposition tends not to be all that well documented. And where this policy started life was 4 years ago, when at the GMB trade union we undertook the probably ill-advised piece of work of compiling a report on the future of work, which looked at all sorts of issues, including AI, and some of those predictions have held up better than others, but also demographics. And when we looked at our key sectors, including schools and childcare, we suddenly focused on the predicted fall in primary-aged children. And I think at the time the prediction was that by 2030 there would be a 10% fall in a number of 5 to 9-year-olds within England, and even in Birmingham, which is a young city, the prediction was a 6% fall. And we were looking at the history as well of the 2000s, when, as people will know, there was all of a sudden a significant increase in the number of kids in the system, the unfortunately named bulge. And at the time, particularly but not exclusively in London, a number of schools closed or reduced their footprint and sold off land. And then when the demand on schools increased, it was very hard for public sector organisations to reacquire land given the increase in values. So we were looking at the estate and thinking about site closures, job losses, and trying to find a way through that would meet wider policy objectives. So I remember going to see Bridget Phillipson's team and laying out a proposal for a capital fund to allow schools to convert unused or underused space to nursery provision. And I think a lot of people in this room will have had the experience of taking some bright idea to policymakers and either getting back a request for many hours of work on reports, or the dreaded words, "That's very interesting, but I think we'll struggle to convince the people we need to of the wisdom of this." And by the way, if anyone is interested in reforming the RPI inflation rate, we can talk about it separately. There's many that we didn't have successes on, but on this, that wasn't the experience. And I have to say that the work that was done in those opposition days and subsequently with the department was, I think, done in the best spirit and constructively, and it was gratifying when the manifesto was published for it to be confirmed that this policy had its origins in work done through the trade union movement. And today, it's as a local MP, it means a lot to have seen this policy going from the genesis of an idea through to something that is tangible and real. And in my constituency, where there are 3 school-based nurseries coming through, one is in the Pride of Place area, where the last nursery provision closed during the pandemic, never to reopen. Another is effectively a rebuild and refurbishment of an existing school-based nursery in a local authority-maintained school which had struggled for many years to attract the funding to refresh that provision. And although it's very well used, if you were to go into it, you would see that it is in desperate need of upgrading. And the third is in an area which historically has had no nursery provision at all. So I think, a lot of positives from this policy, but trying to keep within the 5 minutes, if I can highlight one issue in addition to those which Becca has raised, and going back to the origins of this within looking at workforce challenges, there is a overlap, it's not an absolute, but a certain overlap between the skills profiles of early years workers, school support staff, and social care workers. And it is an objective of government policy to establish national terms and conditions, and we think to raise the pay in the latter 2 categories of workers through the school support staff negotiating body and the adult social care negotiating body. There's always been a degree of wage competition between these sections of the workforce, and at a very local level, that might be most concentrated on those sites where there are both nursery workers and school support staff based. So in the long term, if all of these policies have the success that we hope they do, there is probably something for the government to look at making sure that there isn't higher turnover in the school-based nurseries of staff than there might be in other settings. So that's one issue to highlight, but thank you very much indeed.
Great, thank you very much. Great to hear the policy and political context for the policy. So yeah, Katie Oliver from ARC.
Hi, thank you. I'm Katie from ARC, which is an education charity and one of the country's largest multi-academy trusts. And we run 8 school-based nurseries, soon to be 10 in London, and we're expanding into West Yorkshire next academic year. All of our nurseries work in partnership with schools. That's within the ARC network, but also outside, and they offer places from 0 to 5, all day, all year round, as well as term-time only places for those parents who want that. And we very much focus our work in areas of disadvantage, so around 50% of our families eligible for some sort of deprivation funding. We were first set up in 2020, predating the policy developments, but very much addressing those challenges. So on the one hand, the needs of our schools to really make sure that particularly the most vulnerable children were accessing a really enriching and stimulating early education that meant that they were ready for school, but also that our families needed flexible and affordable childcare. And if I'm honest, it felt at the time in those discussions like that was a real conundrum. After lots and lots of discussions, we decided not to try and set up individual nurseries in each of our individual schools, but rather to set up as a sort of PVI network, working very much in parallel with the schools network. And I think that was a huge amount to do with the way that our school leaders were perceiving some of the things Becky was talking about around the operational complexity of running a nursery. It's a very different operation from a school, staff ratios, different age groups. How do you operate outside of school hours and in the holidays? But also that many of our primary leaders come from a much more Key Stage 2 background, and I think felt slightly kind of anxious about the idea of what it would mean to set up something with such a different kind of domain, the importance of the domain-specific knowledge. I suspect actually that's representative of the wider sector of school leaders, and that is probably, that's probably part of the reason why people are feeling anxious about and not considering opening new nurseries. I was asked to talk a bit about the policy developments that I'd like to see, and I wanted to focus in on one of the recommendations about the clarity of purpose of the programme. And I think DFE colleagues in the room will have heard me say before that I think there is room for better articulation of both the rationale and the benefits of the programme as a kind of driving system quality and system leadership, not just as a way of injecting more places into underutilised buildings, which is, of course, also really makes sense, right? Multi-academy trusts are often talked about as kind of anchor institutions in their communities and having civic leaders with a leadership role. And I think it's in that context that they have such an important part to play in the wider ecosystem and in the early years sector. I don't think that means schoolification of early years. Every nursery should be run by a school or a MAT, or that there's anything inherently better about a school or a PVI, but more that trusts within their communities have a leadership role to play as part of the coalition of organisations that need to be driving up the quality of early years, particularly for our most disadvantaged children. Beyond that, I think that trusts have a role to play as centres of educational expertise and innovation. So at ARC Start, our nurseries have really benefited so enormously from the capacity that our trust has to think really deeply about curriculum, about pedagogy, about assessment, about how best to train and develop staff. And equally, our schools sector, I should say, and our schools colleagues have benefited hugely from the expertise that comes from our early years settings, from the child development knowledge, the very different approaches that are used. And it's one of my great joys to see those exchanges of ideas and of learnings across the two teams and bringing it together. And I think that all links to scale. So where standalone settings can and do completely amazing work, they are inherently quite fragile, and they run, you know, because of the exceptional leadership of individuals and often just on straightforward goodwill. They're hugely vulnerable to the financial challenges that we've talked about and to capacity and other issues. And I think being part of a larger organisation does help you build resilience. You know, our nurseries can share back office, reduce duplication, they can share staff when there's absence and leave, they can succession plan. All of those things make them and make the system more resilient. And so I think for me, that's what kind of trust involvement in the early years sector can bring. And I think it's in recognition of all of those benefits that the DFE has said that all schools should join a multi-academy trust over time. And I guess it feels to me like the early years sector could also benefit from those kind of models of delivery. So I'm going to finish by saying that I think with a bit more clarity of purpose, there would be more trusts interested in innovating in this space. I think there would be more schools not necessarily looking to run nurseries, but to find values-aligned organisations that they can work with to deliver really high-quality provision, and more local authorities who would be able to work to identify those opportunities and broker those partnerships in the best interests of our communities. And it seems to me that that can only be a good thing for early years, for schools, and for our families and children.
Thank you very much, Katie. And I think ARC start a really interesting model coming from a school trust, but also operating on the PVI model as well. Yep. So combining a lot of different aspects of the offer. So next we have Tiffany from the Association of School and College Leaders, who I believe was up at 3 a.m. this morning in order to ensure that she got here.
And can I say there was absolutely no issues with the traffic or the travel, and I got here at just before 7. So thank you.
And she was grumpy.
I'm going to get more grumpy. No, thank you for having me. My name's Tiff Harris. I'm a policy specialist at the Association of School and College Leaders, and we have approximately 27,000 school leader members from primary through to post-16 colleges. So thanks for having me today. You can see what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to start with the impact of setting up a school-based nursery on schools. And the positive impact, especially within disadvantaged settings, is not in doubt. And we would support everything that you can do to support those children. But building relationships with children and families sooner is always going to be a good thing for the reasons that we've already heard. Because you can put early intervention in place, you can establish those key routines, you can support learning, you can improve attendance and attendance routines, and those school readiness gaps, which we've already heard about. However, with just 20% of schools without nurseries planning to set one up, the question is to what extent should government be supporting more schools in setting up these school-based nurseries without first understanding what these barriers might be. So on this, can I just start by saying that when ASCL saw this statistic of 20%, we were not at all surprised. And that doesn't mean that we and these school leaders don't support this initiative or in any way against this. But setting up a school-based nursery can be challenging, and there's a list that I'm going to give you now. Firstly, it will be because of additional workload and fear behind that. Schools are already significantly under workload pressure, alongside the added pressure of cliff edge accountability. Whilst they can see the benefit of having children in their schools sooner, particularly in disadvantaged communities, setting up or expanding a school-based nursery is unlikely to be a top priority for many primary schools right now, because their priorities might instead include, but not be limited to, the ongoing pressures of SEND, teacher recruitment and retention, legal challenges and changes to the workforce, funding and pay, breakfast clubs, wraparound care, the new inspection framework, making sense of what the new national curriculum and assessment is going to be and the implications there, what the new school food standards are going to look like, and navigating the school's white paper. So whilst I spoke about the positive impact of setting up school-based nurseries, it does feel a little like the government's priority was less focused on those benefits to children, but more on removing those barriers to support parents getting back into work. And that's an argument. It just felt a little bit like the focus was not where it should be. So whilst the benefits of school-based nurseries to children is obvious, it should not be a school's priority. to help grow the economy with everything else that they've got to do. And even if it was, school-based nurseries operating in term time only will not help working families. So it feels it's important to mention that school-based nurseries bidding process and the enormity of the capacity and training that is required for some primary schools would be another barrier. So another arguably comment, and Katie alluded to this now, the larger multi-academy trusts and all through settings might have more capacity within their directorate to manage a school-based nursery, and they might embrace this as an opportunity and the opportunity that it should be, quite rightly so. But this is not the case for all primary schools, and many don't have that expertise. We spoke earlier of Sally in the office, who's not a school business manager, but also does school dinners and also does attendance and also, wipes a child's knee when they're fallen over and mops the sick up. So their job is not to project manage. They haven't been trained in project management. They don't even know how to put in a bid for this. And these are particularly those small nurseries and small primary schools, and perhaps they're the ones that need this the most. So from what should the DFE do next, it comes down to training and support and financial investment. And if the focus is on disadvantaged communities, then it should be something that the government recognises as a key barrier here and put that professional development in place to remove that as a hurdle. I'll talk about that a little bit more at the end. And the last point of this takes me to the final section of my talk about policy and plans around school-based nurseries and how they should be developed by the DFE to support schools and school leaders more, so that these school-based nurseries are more effective in supporting disadvantaged children. We at ASCL do acknowledge the listening that the DFE did to make the guidance documents clear and simple as possible. Thank you for listening to that. And we also acknowledge the usefulness of the case studies that was in that guidance. But, as I've mentioned, schools need support and training before they even get to that point. And that's why they need significant financial investment with the initial bidding process and that project management. This might encourage more as an uptake moving forward. And then on schools within disadvantaged communities, to what extent did the government really focus on these regions, and was enough done to boost applications where school-based nurseries were most needed within those regions? And on a final note, in this current world of falling roles where there is space in schools to create or expand a school-based nursery, it is reasonable for schools to have some major concerns about filling these spaces and the funding they will get only if they fill the spaces. So anecdotally, I've met with primary school leaders who were once for many years oversubscribed with a long waiting list, yet now cannot fill their places. It's caused impacts on their funding, and it leads to some creative and at times devastating decision making on how to balance those books. One small rural primary that I know of used to have a reception intake of 15 year on year with a large, long waiting list, and the last 3 years has gone down to 6. And there are some schools in some regions which have closed or in danger of closing. So with the national birth rate now as low as, I think I read an article last week, 1970s, I think it was published, the question will be, maybe one of the biggest barriers is where will these numbers come from longer term, and after that initial funding grant, where will the future funding come from to keep these settings running? Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Tiffany, and a helpful reminder of the sheer scale of challenges that schools are facing in the current context. Lastly, Neil Leach to kind of bring the PVI perspective to this discussion.
Okay, thank you. I was asked if I would speak about the positive aspects, some of the positive aspects of the policy. And anybody that knows me will also know that that's not likely to happen, to be honest. There was a reason, I think it was early last year, that the Telegraph had a headline to say that we were the second most miserable country in the world, and I think I contributed to those statistics. So today's not going to change, but let me start by sort of saying this, that the Alliance's position is absolutely clear. If we are serious that every child, regardless of socio-economic status, regardless of their background, deserves the right to care, education, and development, it should not matter who delivers that care. That care and education, what matters is whether it is of good quality. And I would frankly say there is no place for anybody, whether it be the PVI sector or schools, to think about self-interest. What I do think is important is equity. And I'm not sure that we have, frankly, had that. There's that wonderful statement, every child has talent, but not every child has opportunity. And when I heard at the outset when the programme was being launched that its fundamental objective was to ensure that we reached the most disadvantaged families and that we provided opportunities in government's terms, childcare deserts, I honestly thought this could be a really good opportunity for everybody to sort of gel together and deliver more high-quality places. Particularly, I come back to the point, for children where you get the biggest return on human capital investment, i.e. the most vulnerable and deprived children. But I think, as the report alludes to, that's not exactly what we've got. And when the first phase was launched, I was pretty appalled when I saw the draft guidance, which basically said, yes, and I paraphrase here, but you can work with schools, but you might need to be mindful of giving them long leases because you might want your rooms back. And that didn't feel like a cohesive start. Then we started to see settings being given notice by schools. Settings, one example that came our way was a setting that was rated outstanding, that offered full daycare beyond term time for an offer that replaced it within the school, which was term time only and reduced hours, etc., and for a limited age group of children. Again, that does not feel as if it's really cohesive working. Then what developed, and I just want to quote these to you, was an even further divide between schools and the PVI sector, driven in part by the Department for Education, and not colleagues here. You'll get out safely, it's not you, okay? It's absolutely fine. But when you get the Prime Minister say, we want to create 100,000 new places for childcare, this is 3,000 nurseries around schools, because I think primary schools are the best place for nurseries. So that means children get the opportunity to develop the skills that they need before reception year, which isn't happening in the way it should at the moment. First point. Then colleagues from the DFE released a video saying school-based nurseries will result in easier mornings and make life simpler for families. And then another video promotion that said, and it will be less scary for children to transition into school. What do you think people working in the PVI sector feel when they see those comments? They feel like they are lesser individuals. They're on their knees already. And when you tell them, basically, you're not good enough, that is not exactly terminology and communication that should be coming from the Department of Education. I was interested to think that if this was a teacher in a school, can you imagine, just to labour the point, if you were a teacher in a school and you said to a student, you're rubbish, you're not as good as Sarah, you're second class, nobody would ever think that that would give them any incentive to do better. But in an odd way, that's exactly what we have done in pitting school-based nurseries against the PVI sector. So that has to stop. That's my main point. The other thing I sort of quite like to add to that is that, to give it a slightly positive position, is belatedly we are starting to talk, and Katie alluded to this, about better cohesive working in terms of school-based nursery partnerships, etc. And the language is slightly different. It does talk about utilising other people's skills. Quick question, hands up if you've got an iPhone. Quite a few. Okay. It is interesting that the iPhone is the biggest selling mobile in the world. The chips aren't made by Apple. They are made by TMC. The displays aren't made by Apple, they're made by Samsung, a competitor. And the cameras are made by Sony. So even large corporates recognise, and I'm sure you can see where this is going, why don't you utilise the skills, the infrastructure that is already there? Final point. When you look at the statistics and you look at where these settings are located in terms of school-based nurseries, childcare deserts and the most disadvantaged areas, etc. I think it's around 16%. So if you have 600 nurseries, that is around 96 settings. Maybe the reason I'm miserable about this is because, as well as representing 14,000 nurseries, etc., childminders, we operate 28 settings ourselves exclusively in areas of deprivation. This time 6 years ago, we operated 132. We're not for profit. We don't have to pay private equity. We don't have to pay shareholders. If it breaks even, it's about as good as it gets. We have closed 104 of those settings, all serving the most deprived communities, more than the initiative has given at this particular point in time. And why? Because of a lack of funding. I'd have liked to see ministers look at adequately funding what we have in place. You can have conditionality as long as you have a stable sector. And I accept there will be the odd provider that's interested in them. But the vast majority of providers that I talk to, and you ask them, why do you do this? They use words like, I love children, I want to change their lives, I want to basically do the best that I can. They don't talk about profit and loss accounts, balance sheets and EBITDA. So from that perspective, if we are to be positive in this, we have to have much more cohesive working, and you can't deliver any of this unless it is adequately funded. I'll shut up.
Great, thank you very much, Neil, and a helpful, I think, reality check, I suppose, in terms of the challenges on the ground in such a diverse sector, in terms of delivering what children need, and particularly what children from disadvantaged backgrounds need. Thank you to all the speakers for their contributions. We started a little late, so we might run past 10 if that's okay. But so I'll open up the floor now for questions to any of the panelists. Yeah, and just to remind you, before you speak, if you could give your name and who you work for.
Hello, thanks very much. Corrie Kevin from the Department for Education. I work in the school-based nurseries delivery team. I'm interested, I'm not sure who this question is for, maybe for Tiff or Katie. What are your thoughts on the new phase 3 model, so using local authorities to help a tighter focus on disadvantaged areas and also to take a more holistic, longer-term view of provision in their areas? Do you think that has potential to address some of the issues that you've mentioned today?
Right. I'll take another question, then we can answer them together.
Diana Gerald from Book Trust. We're Book Start, so we essentially support the early years reading infrastructure across the UK. And I'm really interested, we currently reach 400,000 low-income families aged 1 to 4 across the country. That means 153 local authority partnerships and 7,000 partner organisations. As it happens, we were in Birmingham for our Way Day yesterday. Amazing Library of Birmingham, extraordinary women going into local temporary accommodation, supporting play, reading, early years, the local Best Start in Life hub. It's a hugely fragmented sector. So my question for the panel is, we're trying to think ahead. If this policy goes where we hope it's going to, or you hope it's going to, what does that mean for a wider system? Does that leave school-based nurseries as the leadership where we get to more low-income children? Do they just become part of the mosaic? What does the system look like if this approach goes ahead and we're looking 3 years out?
Great, thank you very much. So yeah, the first question on phase 3 and the role of local authorities. Tiff, do you want to maybe start?
Yeah, I was just going to say, do you want to start? But no, I'll start. From our members, we had a mixed response to that. Obviously, we support that move, but feedback was that that place planning information conversation needs to be robust. It needs to have capacity within the local authority to be able to do that job well. And then it still comes down to the capacity within the school to project manage a school-based nursery. I spoke about that already. Even if numbers are there, can schools attract the right staff? in order to provide high quality teaching and learning to those pupils. And again, it comes down to infrastructure. I think the point that I made, and you made it too, Katie, is that if you have the ability to absorb the cost and training within a large mat or setting, then the chances are you are going to thrive and you're going to be able to be more successful in that process. But there are schools that don't have that training and capacity. It doesn't matter whether they're working with local authorities or not. If they don't have the training, the capacity within their team to be able to put that bid together and to then drive that project successfully, then they're not going to go ahead with it. And I think that's going to cause conflict then between the local authority and the schools.
Well, can I take Diana's question first? Because I think it's sort of, for me, they're related. So I guess my answer to that, if I were the DFE, would be that I would like to see more groups of not-for-profit nurseries coming together, working in those areas for the most vulnerable families and across actually the system, taking very much into consideration Neil's earlier point. But I think that, and I think that school-based nurseries and trust leadership can help deliver that. I think that does link directly to some of the challenges of the Phase 3 school-based nursery programme, which has been designed as if every school in the country is an individual school that is in a local authority, and that's just not how the system operates from a school-based perspective. So lots of schools, I actually can't remember the percentages of primary schools, but lots and lots of primary schools are sitting in multi-academy trusts that are non-geographic and that interact with the Department for Education in a very different way than through their local authorities. I think it's also worth saying that local authorities run their sufficiency data and their information about early years in radically different ways and with very, very differing amounts of quality. And I think that links to the third thing, which is, I think probably slightly controversial thing to say, but we talk about quality a lot, but I'm not sure that we all use the same taxonomy or necessarily have the same views about what that means. And I think what that ends up creating is a sort of clash on the ground about who feel, and maybe that speaks partly to some of the challenges, is, well, my parents want to be in my nursery, in my school, but that, maybe they want to be over there. And I think it creates some of that conflict. So I think that there are real challenges with Phase 3. And so far, I have to say, from our perspective in the local authorities we work with, and we have very good relationships with all of our local authorities, it doesn't feel like it's sort of radically changing the way that the programme is going to operate.
Lawrence, yeah.
Very quickly, it's probably too obvious a point to make that it very much depends on your local authority. And I think for those of us who sit in an authority like Birmingham City Council, just emerged from Section 114 status, very high turnover rates amongst the officers, a lot of lost expertise and capacity, that looking at Phase 3 with a sense of trepidation. The schools that I've worked with which have been able to take this forward so far are ones which do have exceptional leadership, in some cases heads who are from a financial background themselves and can really squeeze every penny that comes from the programme, or very strong SBMs in place. I would not necessarily instinctively have confidence that the local authority would be reaching those schools across a city of the size of Birmingham. So I don't want to write it off, and I'm sure there will be colleagues who in this room who would come from a very different kind of local authority who would see it as a positive. But I do think there needs to be oversight and controls in place from the DFE to make sure that some of those problems don't arise.
Thank you.
Can I just come in on that, just to support that, because I was talking to Neil earlier, he might want to come in, but on the local authority, we're just saying that there's many local authority roles that have been eroded over time because the focus has been moved somewhere else, and now it seems that focus is being put back on the local authority. We were talking about the wellbeing schools bill, which also referenced local authority support, but the capacity is not there anymore. So if the government are going to do that, they've got to then shift it back into the local authority. I absolutely agree with the points that you've made there about that being inconsistent. But if this is going to work, then I think the government have got to decide where they're going to put that staffing funding again.
Just on the second point about the I suppose the future evolution of the sector and what the role of school-based nurseries, and that's obviously one of the big questions that I think the report raises. Becky, what were your views on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and particularly also what it means for disadvantaged children. And one of the points that there's never enough time to talk about everything in the report, but one of the things that we made in the report is a point that I think is really important for the future of the setup of the sector is obviously that the funded entitlements are not accessible to many disadvantaged children and families because they're related to working families. So actually we have a situation where even if in your community there is a school-based nursery, you may not be able to qualify for the disadvantaged 2-year-old offer, which has been eroded over time in terms of who can access it. And also you might not be able to get the 30-hour working families offer. So even if one is in your community, you can't necessarily access it. And I think that's a really core question. In terms of the wider setup, you know, I do think this opens up a question about state and private mix within the sector. This is the first real effort for a very long time, really, since Sure Start centres were providing childcare and early education, where the state is making an effort to create more state-based provision. I think it's a really interesting question of where it works. I think it definitely can have really good benefits for school readiness, for putting through those links with schools, but quite often it also can't work for working parents if the school is not able to do the kind of hours that they need, if they're only able to offer during term time. I think a positive of the local authority set up in phase 3 is they can think a bit more about that overall place planning, although I also agree with many of the questions that were raised around their capacity to be able to do that. But, you know, I think there is a need to really clarify what is the role of school-based nurseries going forward in this wider system. Where do we think that there should be state provision for early years settings, and where do PVI settings make sense to work with that? And even if we do see a greater shift over time towards more state provision, I want to echo the points that Neil made about the expertise in the sector and really appreciating that, because I think that is really important, and that should be brought very much into whatever ends up happening within the sector and what that mix ends up being, that we appreciate the existing expertise in the PVI sector.
And just quickly before we bring in some more questions, just to get your sense, Neil, I suppose there's obviously this big question hanging in the air. I suppose what do you see as a kind of productive future direction in terms of the balance of the sector between the PVI and school-based, and how that relationship might work?
I think it is actually utilising what's there. I think schools would benefit. They have the benefits of the premises, they could be adapted, etc., etc. They have the benefits of the VAT and the rates. So use the expertise, use the leadership that's within schools, and there is an easier transition if they're physically there. Nobody is denying that. That's not the same as saying that children would be more scared in going into a nursery. But use the skills of providers that 85% of all hours delivered under the entitlement are delivered by the PVI sector. But why would you not utilise that? That would seem the most economic sense. And I think the point about access is absolutely critical. I feel I need to make this point, right? Some of the most vulnerable children, if the policy is about supporting some of the most vulnerable, disadvantaged families and children, they're the children that are never going to be in those nurseries. Some of their parents can't work. Some of their parents won't work. That's got nothing to do with the child. And if we are arguing that every child should have the opportunity to care and education, this should be a universal offer. Can you imagine a situation where you have a 6-year-old in a school and one of your parents stops working and you say you can only come to school 2.5 days a week? There would be an absolute uproar. But that's exactly what we do in the early years. It is just ridiculous.
Thank you. Okay, we have time for one more round of questions.
Hi, I'm Alice Bradbury. I'm from the UCL Institute of Education. Thank you for all your comments on the report. I think it's absolutely fascinating as someone who's been also researching this policy for the last few months. 2 questions. First one is, one of the things I've heard a lot from schools is a major barrier is just simply recruiting staff to work in your nursery, which is just something that hasn't been mentioned too much today. People existing in schools don't want to move down to the nursery. They don't feel confident enough in the new age range, especially if you've got 2-year-olds, and recruiting is a problem. So what needs to happen to the workforce to support this policy, going into the future? And the second question is really about parents. I think there's a lot of assumptions about what parents want. Parents want easier mornings. And, actually what parents want is a very complicated mixture. As a parent myself, children have gone through mixtures of school-based nurseries, PVI. This idea, this is what parents want, actually, it's not quite that simple, and different parents need very different things. And I think there's a real risk that we have this assumption that everybody can cope with a 9 till 3:30 school-based nursery with no wraparound, and that's some kind of parental ideal, whereas actually it's just simply not practical. And there's a risk that you start telling parents this is the best, when actually, it just isn't possible for many parents.
Thank you.
Hiya, Lydia Hodges, Quorum Family and Childcare. I completely agree with what Neil was saying about access to the entitlements, but he said it very well, so I won't labour the point. But I wanted to ask the panel's opinion about some of the funding models. So I think too often we talk about disadvantaged families and working families as if they are two always distinct groups, and they're really not. A lot of the families that we talk to are both of those things, and they are low-income earners. And very often, unfortunately, neither model works for them because they are quite often working outside of Monday to Friday, 8 till 6, 9 till 3, whatever. But I think also we often talk about those families as if they are static, and that's also not true and not something really that we want. And I think there is a risk with thinking about school-based nurseries as the silver bullet in economically disadvantaged areas, of entrenching that difficulty in those families moving the dial for themselves. Because if you can only get 15 hours, because that's all you're entitled to at that point, it's very difficult to up your hours or to change your working pattern in order to take different work or work more, right? Because you need the chicken and egg situation. You need the place before you can take the work, and you need the work before you can access the entitlements and take the place. And so my question is about this sort of demand-side funding and the panel's opinion on perhaps a more supply-side funding model, and whether or not that would be beneficial. If we look at what we did with the wraparound program, that was very much designed on an oversupply model, right? To inject that into the sector, to create the places, understanding that they might not be completely filled to begin with. Because changing that stuff for families, it can be hard to get a job. It can be hard to increase your hours. It can be hard to feel that you're in the right place to do that, and whether or not that might be a potential.
Great. Thank you very much. So a couple of questions there from the challenges of recruiting staff and the barriers to having a confident workforce in terms of delivering this offer, the question around what parents want and need, and wraparound. And then also the question on, I suppose, improving the lot of disadvantaged pupils and how that relates to the funding model. So I think if I'll go through the panel, and if you can speak to whichever question you please in a kind of relatively far way, if that'd be great. Thank you. I'll start with Becky.
Yeah, I'll just answer on the on the funding point in terms of staffing and how do we get the staff to be able to work in those settings. I think that's a really big issue, and one of the things we did raise in the report as well is the concern that because once these settings are set up, they'll be operating in the same kind of system as a PVI setting is in terms of the funding model, that actually you're pushing, as PVIs are pushed, towards less well-qualified staff, lower quality. And even if it's in a school and you are getting some benefits from being physically near the school, being able to interact, there's still a limit in terms of what you're able to provide just because of the funding that's provided. And I do think that's a long-term issue.
I'll take the workforce question. I think that the answer, and it has to be a long-term answer, is more structure to the labour market in this area. We are already taking these policy initiatives for school support staff, for the adult social care workforce. They are comparable, I think, to the extent that they are both mixed economies. and there have been significant recruitment and retention challenges in both areas. So some kind of model akin to the school support staff negotiating body and the adult social care negotiating body, I think for early years is a missing part of the picture.
I think on recruitment, I think that one of the things that I've found really interesting since we opened Arc Start is there's no question that recruitment's the single biggest challenge that faces the whole sector, right? But what's been really interesting is whenever we go out for our more senior roles, we get huge amounts of applications. And I think, and from within the school system and from outside. And I think that speaks to, there is a real group of people who are at the moment working in the school system, but who do really want to be working in early years and want to be in this sector, but can't quite find the right structures and systems for that working. So I think that is something to be optimistic about. The entry-level roles are really, really, really difficult. And I think there are lots of things that need to be done about that, but mainly I would say it was much more about staff training and staff opportunities within that. I think on the funding model, I want to make a slightly different point, but I think it relates back to the disadvantage funding and some of the stuff Becky was saying, but we should remember that when we're talking, and I totally take the point about low-income families and disadvantaged families and the overlap, low-income working families. One of the things, if you're working with a disadvantaged community, is that you have to have twice as many children to get the same amount of income. And what that means is you're not just pressured potentially to decrease the quality or the cost of your staff body, but you're actually also really incentivized to push out the disadvantaged non-working children, because it does cost more. It costs more partly because some of those children are more vulnerable, but actually it costs more just on a really straightforward basis. There's twice as many children. You need to know twice as many children. You need to process twice as many invoices, all of those things. And I think there is a real lack of understanding about that within the sort of funding model and funding structure. And I would say that I think there's an equity piece about the 30 hours, but actually I think there's a really fundamental question about the funding model and the disincentives in the system for taking those children.
Yeah, I've been scribbling on here. The question about staffing, I just want to take you back to schools. All schools in disadvantaged areas are struggling to recruit high quality staff and retain them. And we can see, I'm talking about all schools generally, we see then outcomes are lower, we see aspirations are lower, we see behaviour concerns being more significant, attendance lower. So that's a problem in schools that are in disadvantaged communities throughout. So that's the first point, that the government need to address that. And why would any teacher want to go into one of those schools and take on that for the same pay and the same conditions as opposed to going to somewhere else? I'm just putting that out there. So with that in mind, how would a primary school that has established a school-based nursery attract, within a disadvantaged area, attract those high-quality early years practitioners? And what would the government do to support that? Because, I mean, and if you think about some of those schools, particularly in coastal regions, how are you going to get them to travel in? And so that is a big concern for me, to get the quality into those settings. And then there's an assumption being made here. I'm only just really repeating the question, but I'm just reiterating it. I don't have the answers. But there's a question around the quality of early years practitioners, and that assumption that no additional training would be needed. And we know in primary schools already, don't we, that if you're a year 5 or 6 teacher, you don't really know what's going on in early years, but because you just don't have the time, do you? And why would you need to know what's going on? We have specialists in the early years, and there's specialists in Key Stage 2, and that's generally where they tend to be, because you know what you're going to do really well. So to suggest that there's space in primary schools and then just make that assumption that you can move staff around would not work without investment, speaking to the sector and asking them if that was something that they would want to do as part of career progression. But again, it comes back to Neil's point. We know where the expertise are, we know where to get them from, so that should be something that's looked at. But I do think staffing is a significant concern. I don't want to talk about funding.
I think we all know about funding.
I think we do.
It's the reality.
There's not enough.
And every financial institution. I spoke with the CMA on Monday, and I was I was at pains to say, well, you might be looking at top-up charges and extras and all the rest of it, but look at the core funding. So there's lots of institutions, IFS, etc., have made the point. Alice, to pick up on the workforce, I think we start with a position where we recognise that the early years is not a mechanism just to allow mums to go back to work, that it is a fundamental part, the most important part of a child's development and education. And again, whether it's Heckman or others, the researchers out there that shows it. And yet, as everybody will know, if you take the Heckman graph and look and reverse it in terms of investment, that's where it happens to be. So we spend over £18 billion a year fixing problems rather than investing to stop it at the outset. I would say this. If you type into any search engine, what are the most respected professions in the world? I tell you, teachers will come up there in the top 10, without a doubt. The first day I did this happened to be the same day, and you may have seen this, that the Sun newspaper published a graphic which said the 20 jobs that no one wants to do. And guess where early years was? Early years practitioner is the term they use rather than educator or teacher, right in the middle. It is interesting, and because I come from a finance background, perhaps this is my bias, but to buy the average house in England, you would need 5 early years educators living in that home, combining their income to get the average mortgage, full stop. Whereas, and this is not about diminishing other professions, but to give it context, if you're a refuge worker, you only need 3.5. If you're a postal worker, you only need 3. And so that sort of reflects how, as a society, and how a priority it does not exist in real terms when it comes to investment within the government with our people. 2 weeks' time, I sit in front of the Low Pay Commission, yet again, to give evidence as to why it is that our colleagues working in early years are at the bottom of the pile. And it is also interesting to note, despite the fact that they're at the bottom of the pile, we did some research on people leaving the sector. 77%, 3 reasons, 77% said they felt undervalued. 72% said they were exhausted. And only 52%, I'm looking at Caroline because if I'm wrong, she will criticise me afterwards. I'm right, okay, great. 52% talked about earnings. This is a profession, this is the most important thing that we could be doing. What else is more important? And I can't help feeling, when you wake up in the morning and you look at the news and you look at some of our world leaders, you can't help thinking, if they were in an early years environment and had good social and emotional development, we wouldn't have to spend 50 billion pounds on arms and warfare. Invest in the early years, the return is massive. But that means a workforce that is valued.
Thank you, Neil. And I think that's a great note to finish on, I think, in terms of the importance of this issue, the relevance it has to the prospects for everybody in society, for inequalities that continue to open after children start school. And I think it underlines the importance of getting this policy right. I know, obviously, we never have enough time to cover all the issues, and there are a lot of there's a lot of hope, I think, for the school-based nursery programme, a lot of potential, but obviously we've seen through this discussion there are a lot of challenges as well in terms of implementation, and this, I think, conversation will go on and on. I would flag that in a couple of weeks' time, on the 18th of June, we're running a webinar that's a bit more practice-focused, so drawing learnings from our case studies and the research as a whole that's targeted at settings, schools, local authorities who might have an interest in the practicalities of setting one up and running one. So tell your friends about that. But yeah, just to finish on thanking the whole panel for all their contributions. It's been a really fascinating discussion, I think, and a great range of perspectives. And a final thank you to Nuffield Foundation for funding the research project as a whole, and also this event. And thank you all for coming. We have the room until past, so feel free to continue the conversation. Thank you.